In the bustling neighborhood of Isolo, Lagos, an 8-flat apartment complex became the center of an unexpected and explosive conflict that quickly escalated into the talk of the town. The building, managed by a mild-mannered caretaker named Mr. Babatund, had always housed a mix of quiet, law-abiding tenants, that is, until a disagreement about pets turned the peaceful abode into a battleground. The trouble started when one of the tenants, Mrs. Adaubi, a middle-aged woman living in Flat 5, decided to adopt a small, rambunctious dog named Bingo. She was fond of animals, and Bingo, with his playful antics and energetic barking, quickly became her companion. However, this didn't sit well with her neighbor, Mr. Bayo, who lived directly below her in Flat 3. Mr. Bayo was a strict, no-nonsense man, well known for his intolerance of noise and disorder. The barking, constant scratching, and even the occasional dog mess in the stairwell drove him to the edge. The apartment building had no strict policy on pets, and Mrs. Adaubi, believing it was her right to own a dog, brushed off the initial complaints from Mr. Bayo. But as the days went by, Bingo's barking became more frequent, particularly in the evenings when Mr. Bayo liked to unwind after long hours at work. His patience were thin, and he decided it was time to take action. One fateful evening, Mr. Bayo confronted Mrs. Adaubi outside the building as she was returning from a walk with Bingo. Voices were raised and neighbors began to gather. Watching the altercation unfold, Mr. Bayo accused her of being inconsiderate, allowing her dog to disrupt the peace of the building. Mrs. Adaubi, in turn, accused him of being intolerant and heartless, claiming that her dog had just as much right to be there as any tenant. The argument soon spiraled out of control. Mr. Bayo, enraged, threatened to report the issue to the caretaker and take legal action if necessary. Mrs. Adaubi, not one to back down, warned him that if he continued to harass her, she would bring the issue to the Tenants Association and ensure that everyone knew who the real troublemaker was. The next morning, true to his word, Mr. Bayo marched to the caretaker's office. Mr. Babatund, caught in the middle of the escalating feud, listened carefully but was hesitant to take sides. He urged both parties to calm down and try to reach a compromise, but it was clear the situation was far from being resolved. Days later, tensions reached a boiling point. Mr. Bayo, in a fit of frustration, reportedly threw a bucket of water at Bingo while the dog was innocently playing in the courtyard. Mrs. Adaubi, upon seeing this, exploded with rage. She stormed into Mr. Bayo's flat, shouting and demanding an apology. A shouting match ensued, and things quickly got physical. Neighbors rushed to intervene as the two engaged in a scuffle, each accusing the other of overstepping boundaries. The fight attracted a crowd from the nearby streets, and soon, the apartment became a hotspot of gossip. The story of Bingo's battle spread across Isolo like wildfire. Neighbors, friends, and even local shopkeepers weighed in on the matter, taking sides. Some believed Mr. Bayo had overreacted, while others felt Mrs. Adaubi should have been more considerate of the shared living space. With the entire neighborhood talking, it wasn't long before the police were called to mediate the situation. Officers arrived at the scene to find a large group of people gathered outside the building, discussing the brawl in animated tones. After separating the two tenants and taking statements, the officers advised both parties to maintain the peace and suggested that the landlord be brought in to mediate a more permanent solution. The incident left a lasting impact on the apartment building. The Tenants Association eventually passed new rules regarding pet ownership, with specific guidelines for noise control and cleanliness. While Mrs. Adaubi was allowed to keep Bingo, she was required to train him to reduce his barking and ensure that he did not disturb the other tenants. Mr. Bayo, meanwhile, was warned against taking matters into his own hands in the future. Despite the resolution, the story of the fight between Mr. Bayo and Mrs. Adaubi became a local legend, often retold in the streets of Isolo. People would chuckle over how a small dog had managed to turn a quiet apartment into the center of neighborhood drama. The tenants, however, would never forget how a simple issue of pet control spiraled into one of the most talked about incidents in the area. Property and facility management perspective. From a property and facility management standpoint, the dispute between Mr. Bayo and Mrs. Adaubi underscores the importance of having clear, enforceable guidelines regarding pet ownership and tenant behavior in shared living spaces. The lack of a defined policy on pets in the apartment complex contributed to the conflict, leaving both parties to interpret their rights independently. The property manager, Mr. Babatund, was caught in the middle without a formal framework to reference, making it difficult for him to mediate effectively. Had there been a clear policy in place detailing acceptable pet sizes, noise limits, and responsibilities for pet waste management, both tenants would have had a guideline to follow, potentially preventing the escalation of the conflict. Additionally, routine inspections and consistent communication from management could have identified issues, such as noise or cleanliness, before they became serious grievances. Key takeaway for property and facility management: clear policies, draft and communicate clear policies on pet ownership, noise control, and shared space etiquette. Proactive management: regularly check in with tenants to identify and resolve disputes. Early mediation protocols: establish a formal conflict resolution process that gives tenants a clear path to address disputes without escalating to violence or police intervention. Moral perspective: from a moral perspective, the story reveals how a lack of mutual respect and understanding can easily lead to discord in communal living environments. Both Mr. Bayo and Mrs. Adobe acted out of self-interest without considering the impact of their behavior on the other person. Mr. Bayo failed to approach the situation with empathy, reacting aggressively to the pet's noise, while Mrs. Adobe dismissed the discomfort her dog caused her neighbor, refusing to make any adjustments. A morally responsible approach would have involved both parties seeking to understand each other's concerns and find a compromise. Mr. Bayo could have calmly expressed his discomfort with the dog's behavior in a non-confrontational manner, and Mrs. Adobe could have been more considerate, perhaps keeping the dog indoors during certain hours or seeking professional training for bingo. Key takeaway from a moral perspective: empathy, practice, understanding and patience in communal living. Responsibility: tenants have a moral duty to ensure that their personal choices do not negatively affect the peace and comfort of others. Compromise in shared spaces: it's essential to seek compromises that balance individual freedom with communal harmony. Legal perspective: legally, the story touches on several important issues concerning tenant rights and responsibilities. In most jurisdictions, landlords and property managers have the legal right to set rules about pets, noise, and cleanliness within their properties, as long as those rules are clearly outlined in the rental agreement. In this case, the absence of such rules left room for ambiguity, which contributed to the escalation of the conflict. Mr. Bayo's decision to physically attack the dog and the subsequent altercation between him and Mrs. Adobe could have legal consequences. Physical harm to animals, even in frustration, can be considered animal cruelty and is subject to legal penalties under Nigerian law. Additionally, the physical altercation between the tenants could lead to charges of assault, depending on the severity of the fight. Key takeaway from a legal perspective: lease agreements clearly define and enforce policies on pets, noise levels and tenant conduct in the lease agreement. Tenant rights: tenants have the right to peaceful enjoyment of their space, but that right must be balanced with others' rights. Legal boundaries: taking matters into one's own hands, e.g., physical aggression, can have serious legal consequences, potentially leading to fines or imprisonment. Lessons learned: clarity of rules is essential. The story highlights the importance of clear, well-communicated rules in any shared living environment. Had the apartment complex had explicit guidelines regarding pets, much of the tension could have been avoided. Effective conflict resolution mechanisms: tenants and landlords should have access to effective, structured methods of dispute resolution, such as mediation. If either party had been able to express their concerns in a neutral, facilitated environment, the conflict may not have escalated to a physical altercation. Respect for shared spaces: shared living requires consideration of others' comfort. Mrs. Adobe and Mr. Bayo both failed to prioritize communal harmony, choosing instead to react defensively. Tenants should always be mindful of how their actions affect those around them. Legal consequences of physical altercations: the altercation, both with the dog and between the tenants, illustrates the potential for legal consequences when individuals take matters into their own hands. Violence, even in minor forms, can have severe ramifications, both criminally and socially. Proactive property management: the caretaker's passive approach allowed the situation to fester. Active and involved property management could have addressed the issue at an early stage, avoiding the conflict's escalation. In conclusion, this story provides important lessons on the need for structured management, mutual respect, and legal awareness in shared living environments. If you find this story insightful, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more content on property, facility, and real estate management tips. Thank you for watching and see you next time. God bless you.